Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give us a few minutes here to let more attendees trickle in before we get started. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar in this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar series. My name is Virginia Rhodes. I'm the project director for the ARC Network, and we're very excited to host the second presentation from cohort 4 of the Virtual Visiting Scholars Program. This program empowers scholars to complete metasyntheses and meta-analyses of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. Now, before we introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I'd like to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with registrants and post it to the ARC Network website at a later date. Live captioning is also available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. And to the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. And then the center are options for Q&A and chat. For the beginning of our webinar, you'll only be able to view chat messages from the ARC team. We'll also use the chat to share links to resources and our feedback survey at the end. We'll open the chat for participants once we finish with the prompted part of our discussion. And if you have any questions for the speaker, please feel free to add them to the Q&A during the presentation, where you can also upvote questions. Next, ARC Network's PI, Dr. Heather Metcalf, will share more about who we are as the ARC Network and introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Virginia. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. As Virginia mentioned, I am the PI of the ARC Network, and I'm also Director of Research for our home organization, the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program. Building on NSF Advanced program efforts, the ARC Network aims to connect widely dispersed scholars and practitioners committed to STEM equity in an engaged stakeholder community. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, our virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like our webinar series. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit our website at equityinstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. Now, for why we're all here, to introduce our speaker. Today, we are joined by Dr. Radhika Lisnik. Radhika is a sociologist with over 6 years of teaching and research experience. She currently teaches at the Department of Sociology and Criminology at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. Originally from Moldova, Radhika has found another home in Arkansas. Radhika has a bachelor's of law studies from Romania, a master's degree in sociology, and an interdisciplinary PhD degree in public policy from the University of Arkansas. Her research focuses on investigating gender and race inequality, institutional policies, and practices in the context of higher education institutions. It's my pleasure to introduce Radhika and to welcome her to the stage to present her work with you today. Thank you, Radhika.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Heather. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so can you see my screen? The PowerPoint slide?
It looks great. It's not on presenter yet, but it's now we see your presenter view rather than the presentation view.
Okay.
There you go.
Is it working now?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. I'm just going to test to see if I can move from the slides. Okay, yes, that works. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for attending this presentation of mine. Before I start, so like Heather said, my name is Untitled. Before I start the presentation about the project, I would first like to thank everyone at the ARC Network who supported this project. I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity to work on something that I'm passionate about. So thank you everyone very much. I would also like to thank the ARC Network for connecting me with a mentor. I'd like to thank Ethel Mickey for the feedback she provided that was very helpful for making progress on a project that is quite complex. I'd also like to thank the mentors at the University of Arkansas, where I teach, Dr. Anna Zajacek for revising my proposal, and Dr. Laurie Holyfield for providing feedback, especially about the methodology part of the project. So as Heather already mentioned, my research is about gender and race inequality in higher education. I'm also looking at institutional policies and practices and how those reduce or exacerbate inequalities in higher education. My focus usually is on institutional policies and practices and how those influence women's job satisfaction and other work outcomes. However, with this project, with the Virtual Visiting Scholar project, I'm taking a little bit of a different approach. I'm taking a more agentic approach, and I'm looking at how women of color faculty in STEM respond to the institutional policies and practices that are in place in higher education, and how they survive in a work environment that was originally designed around white men. So the topic is strategies of persistence among women of color in STEM fields. I would like to provide a little bit more context for this project. I started thinking about persistence strategies, especially after reading a lot of literature that says that STEM environments are usually characterized by white and masculinized norms and values, and therefore the performance expectations, the norms of what is a good scientist are set around white men's experiences. Also, the literature that talks about that women of color do not receive equitable institutional support, they experience isolation, they work under unclear performance criteria. All of these motivated me to think about how do they survive, how do they persist given these circumstances. So in this slide, as you can see, I like to think about persistence using the tree metaphor. So when there are strong winds, resilient trees tend to adapt to that wind, tend to adapt to the environment. So, and they start growing in the direction or bending in the direction that the wind blows. So they do not break. And that's the definition of resilience. That's the one thing that scientists and the natural sciences talk about. And So therefore, the definition of persistence for my project is related to strategies of survival, coping mechanisms that help women of color faculty be successful in their careers. And these include resiliency strategies as well. These include the strategies for success and resistance strategies as well. Now, the literature that I looked at does not give a clear, a comprehensive definition of what persistence is, and therefore I conceptualized persistence using multiple studies. Okay. So I would like to talk about my research questions. The research questions, basically, I'm looking at the persistence strategies that women of color use to navigate the working requirements in a work environment that is characterized by exclusionary departmental cultures and practices. And I'm interested in particular to see how those strategies, how successful they are in overcoming barriers, and which means that I'm interested to see whether those strategies are well balanced and contribute to supporting women as whole human beings rather than just their career aspect. The main component of this project is interethnic differences in persistence strategies. So in other words, do Latina faculty have developed different strategies of persistence compared to Black women faculty or compared to Indigenous or Asian women faculty? Ethnicity, as you will see, is a factor that influences the kind of persistence strategies that women faculty develop. Data collection, I used a systematic literature review approach to collect the data. I went through 14 bibliographic databases that are having peer-reviewed articles or other literature about women faculty in STEM. One example is Academic Search Complete and Compendex. While searching through these databases, I used different key terms, related to different key terms like resiliency, coping mechanisms, persistence. So after getting thousands of results, I used the application called RIAM, which is very helpful. It helped me a lot to sift through all that literature, and it helped me screen the abstracts that are most relevant to the search criteria. So after using Ryan, I also went through the references list of the identified articles and found additional studies. So I used the purposive search criteria to identify the sample. So I looked at literature published in the past 10 years. So more recent studies are important to, especially for talking about policy implication and changes that are applicable to academia today. And then I focus on women faculty of color, faculty in STEM departments in the United States only because of cultural differences between countries. And I'm looking at peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, PhD and master's thesis as well, just for sample purposes. So the data that I used in the study in the project are 66 studies, which were identified for preliminary reading. Out of these 66 studies, I selected 18 for in-depth coding, in-depth qualitative coding, and the focus is on Black, Latina, Indigenous, and Asian women faculty in STEM fields. And also the focus is on assistant and associate professor faculty rank. The method of analysis that I used is meta-ethnography, which is very helpful for synthesizing qualitative findings from multiple studies and for developing new interpretations based on those syntheses, all while taking into consideration the original context of the studies. The coding involved in-depth qualitative coding using the software NVivo. NVivo is quite versatile, so the listing of concepts and the translation of studies into one another because of the features that are in NVivo is something that happens concurrently. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the organization of the next few slides. I'm going to talk about the findings and implications of the study. First, I'm going to talk about the themes. So I listed here all the themes that I identified, and each theme is based on 3 to 5 codes. And then I'm going to talk about policy implications. Okay, so one of the themes that is identified in this project is that of purposeful life. Women of color have qualities and values that shape an academic life filled with purpose. And this is driven by their devotion to profession. And in many studies, women of color faculty talk about their passion for science and how that fueled their determination to persist in an academic environment that is filled with barriers. They describe their passion for teaching, for research, and for mentoring students, especially for mentoring underrepresented students. They also have an appreciation of where they come from, and this they describe where they come from and the values they got in early life from their families, from their teachers in schools, and they talk about qualities they developed through all these venues, qualities like self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, curiosity, valuing education, all of the skills that are very helpful as an academic, as a scientist. Related to this theme is also the theme of purposeful life is also the code identified, which is community service. Community service and being connected to their roots through service is something that gives women purpose. It's something that they are enjoying, and it helps them persist in academia. They talk about community service that is the lifeblood that sustains them in their professional life, even though that kind of service is not valued by academic standards. They do feel that it is not wasting time, but it is contributing to a greater good. So examples from the studies that I have read include women talk about research projects related to health issues in indigenous tribes, and they enjoy contributing and using their gifts they got through academia to improve lives in their communities. Another theme identified in this study is navigating workplace hostility. This theme is about, basically, many studies talk about the fact that women of color are systematically subjected to microaggressions, sexual harassment, tokenism, and other forms of gendered and racialized biases. So in this context, women of color develop strategies and coping mechanisms. So one of the strategies is focusing on the positives and ignoring the negatives. They talk about the fact that fighting against workplace discrimination can hinder career progress. It distracts them from the main focus of their work. So they believe that engaging in such conflicts is not necessary, and they need to really choose their battles and address instances of discrimination, racism, sexism, only when it is absolutely necessary. Another strategy that they use to persist or to survive is working harder. So many studies talk about the fact that women of color feel compelled to work harder than their white colleagues. And they talk about feeling this extra pressure to perform, especially because of the peer culture and their departmental environment, which questions their belonging in science. So they basically engage in this extra hard work in order to be treated as equals by their colleagues. So while this helps them survive in their academic positions, this can be hurtful to their overall well-being because they're basically overworking themselves. Another strategy that they're using is establishing validity for their experiences. So they usually, women of color are reluctant to directly express what they are going through. They won't talk directly about their experiences with racism and sexism in the workplace. And when there is a conflict, when they need to speak with a superior about something like that, they usually talk and they pair their way to their statements using data and historical context. And usually women of color prefer, and I mean, they try to avoid talking with colleagues about such discrimination because they know they won't be listened to or understood. So what they do is they work on building research projects that establish credibility for their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So another strategy that they use to navigate workplace hostility is creating allies. They talk about the fact that finding colleagues who would listen to their experiences and who would give them advice about how to handle gender and racialized biases in the workplace is something that is very helpful. And in general, they strive to create a positive, supportive environment around themselves, surrounding themselves with people who would support them. Another theme that emerges from this project is navigating work culture and redefining cultural expectations. So STEM fields in the United States are characterized by and are designed around white and masculinized norms and values. So in this context, women of color develop strategies that help them survive. So one of these strategies is cultural adjustments. Women of color develop dual identities to survive in STEM fields. So what does this mean? This means that they learn the behavioral norms to succeed in academia, However, at the same time, they value and nurture their own perspectives from their own culture. And one quote from one of the study that is evocative of this strategy is that the academy is willing to accept only those aspects of my identity that the institution deems palatable. So they learn how to basically behave in ways that are expected of them at work, by the white masculinized culture and STEM fields. However, on a more positive note, cultural expression is very helpful for women to succeed in academia. For example, Native American women seek cultural expressions from mentoring, teaching, and research. One example that stems from indigenous culture is that of mentoring. They seek mentoring opportunities because that reflects their value of contributing to the development, the career development of a junior scholar, and therefore they feel like they're giving back through that academic role. So there's also another strategy that women of color use to navigate the workplace culture, and that is redefining success. Women of color work on redefining what success means to them, so that they are not influenced by what the institution tells them is success. So their new definitions emphasize connecting to people, making things better for their communities, being real, and not losing themselves in work. Another theme emerging from this project is that of professional support systems. Many studies in this project talk about the fact that women of color have difficulties finding mentors who can fully understand their experiences. They have difficulties finding mentors who would be mentors on an ongoing basis. However, regardless of whether they have access to mentoring or they don't, mentoring has a very positive influence on their career progress and on their persistence in academia. So mentors provide useful advice for navigating promotion requirements, for dealing with bias and discrimination. Mentors can also be good role models and provide emotional support for them. One thing to note about mentoring is that women of color find more successful mentoring relationships with women mentors in general. They don't, most studies do not talk about whether, what the race of the women mentors. They talk about the fact that women are better mentors because they are more likely to anticipate the needs of their mentees. And they also talk about the usefulness of finding mentors who are in senior positions, because those mentors with senior positions are more likely to support them, especially when coming up for tenure or promotion. Another code that is part of this theme is networking. Involvement in professional organizations is conducive to women's success, to their persistence, especially when they do not, women of color sometimes do not find enough support in their departments, in their institutions. So outside the institution, professional organizations, especially minorities serving organizations, are conducive for their career success. They find motivation, they find support in these organizations. They also find collaborators for research, and they feel like they can be their authentic selves within those minority serving organizations. So another code related to this theme is collegial work environment, which is as women women of color explain, is crucial for them getting promotion. Supportive colleagues are usually willing to assist women of color with their research and with their teaching activities. And they also provide advice about navigating work requirements and academic norms. Another theme identified in the study is personal strengths and support systems. And this theme is based on several codes. Spirituality is one of the emerging codes, and this talks about the fact that spiritual practices gives them confidence to handle obstacles and to stay grounded no matter what difficulties they encounter in their workplace. And this is something that is very important for them. Some women of color say that even if they don't have any support in their department, they still feel strong enough because of their spiritual practices. Faith-based communities are very important for Black women's persistence in academia. Confidence is another code that contributes to persistence. So they talk about things that how their confidence developed due to the support of their parents, of their teachers. And this is something that they have an internal characteristic, and it helps them keep calm during uncertain tenure times, gives them a sense of options in life and a sense of having the ability to ask questions and negotiate with anyone. Another code that is related to this theme is the personal support systems. And this basically is about relationships with partners, parents, siblings, friends. And having these relationships helps women cope with issues such as job stress, bicultural stress, work-life balance, and discrimination in the workplace, which leads to their persistence. So to answer the second part of the project, which is what are the interethnic differences between the strategies of persistence that women of color use, I found a couple of differences that are important to be noted here. In particular, when it comes to Indigenous women faculty, they have a unique perspective about the relationship between their spiritual beliefs and career success. So to them, spirituality is related to their success, and they talk about success being connected to uplifting the community. So this idea that one can be successful if they contribute to something greater than themselves, something that they get from their spiritual beliefs. And they also talk about the fact that their identities as scientists are intertwined with their efforts to contribute to their communities. So they see themselves as good scientists when they are able to translate what they have learned in academia into something that contributes to improving their lives of the people in their communities. So this definition of a successful scientist as one who has the collective's interest in mind comes in contrast to the definition of success that is predominant in academia, and which is based on the white masculinized notions that success is something of an individual nature. Another interethnic difference identified in the study is related to Asian women faculty who experience barriers building social networks within professional organizations outside their institutions where they work. So they talk, two studies talk about the fact that Asian women faculty do not feel like they belong in these organizations. However, they're able to find a better support within their own institutions and within their departments from departmental and institutional leaders. Another interethnic difference is related to Black women who emphasize the importance of the church communities, their faith-based communities, which is something unique. And they talk about the fact that faith-based communities, which are other Black women who are not academics, but they understand what their friends are going through, and they fulfill these roles of providing emotional and psychological support, which is very helpful for Black women faculty, especially when they are going through difficulties at work. Another interethnic difference is that related to Latina faculty. They experience work-family conflict, which hinders their ability to persist in academia. This conflict is related to cultural expectations about having children, prioritizing family, and traditional domestic gender roles stemming from the cultures. So I'd like to speak about the policy implications based on these findings, based on the themes. So one implication is that institutions need to evaluate the standards of what constitutes valuable academic work. So emphasis needs to be placed on the importance of community-related research and teaching projects, because serving the community is what motivates women of color faculty and what helps them persist in academia. Another emerging policy implication is that institutions really need to address the issues of microaggressions and gender and race-based discrimination in the workplace. And this can be done through climate workshops, implicit bias workshops for faculty in order to address the hostility that women of color faculty experience. So the goal here is to create a workplace environment where women of color can freely talk about issues related to sexism and racism, and where they are not compelled to work harder. Institutions also need to work on creating a multicultural environment, and that could be accomplished through cultural sensitivity workshops for faculty. So the idea here is to create a work environment where women of color do not have to leave part of their identities at the door. Lastly, it is important for universities to have family-friendly policies that would support caregivers, especially taking into consideration the work-family conflict that Latina faculty experience. Flexibility in work schedules, a departmental environment that supports parents would provide the necessary respite for Latina faculty. Okay. Thank you very much for being here, for listening. If you have questions about the findings, here's my information. My email address is rlisnik@uark.edu. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Radhika. We're gonna switch over here to Q&A.
Okay. I have a Q&A slide if you want.
Perfect. So we've got a few questions for you. The first from anonymous attendee, just wants to say such a great talk, and then ask what policy would help to have in place so women of color do not need to leave their identities at the door.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Well, I believe, based on what I've read, I believe that really institutions need to create a multicultural environment where faculty, and not just faculty, everybody can express themselves in multiple ways and be considered still acceptable. So cultural sensitivity workshops is something that would help. Another thing that recommendation from the studies is creating spaces for different cultural and spiritual practices. This is something that women of color mentioned.
Okay, perfect. Kind of similar here. Are there any other examples you would say of policies that you see as especially empowering and great?
Especially empowering when it comes to multicultural identities. Is that what? Well, one of the things that is mentioned in the studies is that women of color feel compelled to wear the Western dress, to, the Native American women, Asian women, they try to look like, a typical Western professional. And the ideal here and what they wish is that there would be more acceptance of different ways of presenting oneself in a professional way.
Thanks. Someone asks, can you speak more about effective mentoring strategies and what came up in your codes?
Oh, okay. Yes. The mentoring strategies. So one of the things that stood out to me was Indigenous women faculty speaking about the fact that when they do have mentors, those mentors do, and who are not Indigenous people, they do not understand their culture, and therefore they don't know what kind of advice to give them. They don't know how to support them. And they also make assumptions about their behavior in a way that, for example, they assume humility means lack of confidence or lack of knowledge, while humility is some value that is a quality that is highly valued in their cultures. Similarly, for Asian women faculty, they talk about the fact that especially their international, in their cultures, being humble, humility it's a quality, it's highly valued quality, which is seen here as lack of confidence again. So many of the studies talk about providing, again, cultural sensitivity workshops so that these behaviors or qualities that are exhibited by people from different cultures are not taken as something negative.
I definitely see that. Going back to policy here, what strategies can be used for more equitable faculty evaluation?
Oh, okay. They do talk about that as well. Several studies talk about that, and actually, some women of color mentioned the fact that they get negative feedback. It's just, feedback that is not constructive. That's just negative, doesn't help them progress in their careers. And they talk about learning to redefine what is helpful feedback and what is not helpful feedback, so that they are not broken by the negativity that comes sometimes. And finding people who give them better constructive feedback. Yeah.
Someone asked, was there data you wish you could have got access to that you did not come across?
I wish there was more data about Asian women faculty. I have only 2 studies. That, and also when it comes to cultural expressions, that code, I wish there was more information about that. That's something for future studies. It is not, the studies talk about it, this is the disadvantage of using secondary data. I cannot ask what is specifically these cultural expressions. They talk in general, like they want to be able to express themselves culturally through teaching and service and research, but it's not very clear what that means. So future studies could perhaps look into that and what that means.
Yeah, I completely agree. Definitely need more intersectional studies on these kinds of topics. Here's a kind of long question for you. Did you look at differences across disciplines? And they say they imagine there could be some variance. And if not, do you have an anecdotal sense from the literature you reviewed about how persistence and challenges vary across the humanities, social sciences, and hard sciences, for example?
Okay, this is another very good question. I'm assuming there could be differences. However, taking into consideration the scarcity of the literature on the topic of persistence, so I only looked at and analyzed studies that talk about STEM fields. And from what I've seen within STEM fields, I basically didn't pay attention to the differences within STEM fields. I'm assuming there could be differences between STEM and non-STEM fields, just because women of color are not so underrepresented in non-STEM fields. But I don't know that. I have the literature related to persistence in non-STEM fields. However, that's probably another research project. Something very interesting to look at. And I'm sure it's, again, another future recommendation for a future study.
Yeah. Let's see here. What would you say is the biggest lesson you've learned from this project? And how do you see this meta-analysis as informing your future research?
Okay, thank you. Very good question. So I do see this project. I do see how it goes into future, how it relates to future potential projects where I could look into what I could do interviews with women of color, like Asian, all the 4 groups that I mentioned: Asian, Black, Latina, Indigenous, and understand what cultural expression really means to them. That's something that I'm very curious to know. And the overall lesson from this project is that women of color in STEM are spending a lot of time and effort navigating complex gendered and racialized relationships in the workplace, complex racialized structure, the gendered and racialized structures which really deflect their time and effort from their main goals of their careers. So the idea here is that everyone, women of color, the community, academia, science in general, would benefit if institutions would address with these biases, so that women of color could really focus on their science, and they could do what they are passionate about, and what they're and why they joined academia in the first place. So that's the main conclusion of this one of the main conclusions in this project. Another conclusion, another thing that is very interesting is, and that stood out to me, is the perspective of indigenous women faculty. Most of their beliefs, their values about what success means, what being an academic scientist means, is contradictory to the traditional view of, in academia, of what, being published, being success, getting grants and being famous is. So it's really bringing a new perspective of, well, for academia, not for indigenous cultures. And it's something that could be useful for academia to perhaps apply in their approach to science.
Great. On a similar note on lessons learned, could you please comment further about what you learned about the meta-ethnography research method in doing this study? So in particular, you mentioned it's possible to draw new findings out of the set of studies. What is an example of that?
Okay. So I have learned about the meta-ethnography from my mentor, actually, who is another visiting virtual scholar. And I liked it. I have done qualitative work before, and I thought that this would be very helpful for me to use, because I wanted to really look in depth at and have these rich, detailed descriptions of what persistence looks like. So I do think that based on what I have synthesized in this project, these conclusions that I talked about the contrast between especially indigenous women's perspective and with the white masculinized academic culture, those are new interpretations that are emerging using the meta-ethnographic method.
I think we have time for one last question here. So did you have to anonymize any of the data you found, or was it already anonymized? And if you did, can you talk about that process a little bit?
Anonymize the data? I believe this is something that is, since it is open data, it's not necessary to anonymize, and the information about participants in the study, because it's secondary data, it's already anonymized.
Well, that's great. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing this incredible work, Radhika, and thank you to our audience for your wonderful questions. And thank you for joining us and supporting our virtual visiting scholars. Yeah, I'd ask that you please provide feedback on your experience with today's webinar by completing the survey that will be linked in the chat. And the next presentation for cohort 4 will be on December 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring Dr. Rochelle Hendricks-Stirrup. And the registration link for that will also be found in the chat. Next week, our home organization WEPAN will be hosting its second annual Women of Color Summit, which provides a platform for women of color in the STEM fields and their allies to network, engage in authentic discussions, and share best practices. You're invited to join us as we host some exciting speakers on topics including supporting women of color and entrepreneurs, intentional institutional change, and cross-organizational collaboratives for women of color in engineering. You'll hear from amazing folks like ARC Network's co-PI, Dr. Rochelle Williams, Advanced Journal editor and former Advanced Program Officer, Dr. Kelly Mack, and many, many more. And the registration link for that will also be in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your week.